What relationship does the original Thanksgiving have to where we are as a nation today? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know that brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, belated happy Thanksgiving and a belated happy Thanksgiving to all of our viewers and listeners.
Absolutely. I hope everyone had a great time with their family or friends around the table with all that fancy turkey trimming.
All right, Richard. You know, we've established a little custom here at FFF in our 33-year history, and that's to discuss Thanksgiving in the context of libertarian principles. And you have written about this several times over the years, but I
Yeah.
think it's important that we go back to the same story. It's part of our tradition now here at FFF, but it's an important tradition because it deals with the principles that we've been enunciating for 33 years, how socialism has proved to be the bane of mankind, that the secret to the production of wealth and the secret to higher standards of living lie with a free market private property order, and that if you want more poverty and more suffering, adopt a socialist system. If you want higher standards of living, especially for those at the bottom of the economic ladder, then you got to go with a free market private property order. But a lot of these principles are demonstrated or were demonstrated with respect to the first Thanksgiving. So since you have written about this over the years, I now pass the baton over to you.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you. Well, there's first of all, there's the standard story that all of us sort of grew up with. Well, the pilgrims came to the New World because of religious persecution, which was true. The Puritans were being persecuted because of their religious beliefs by the Church of England. And they wanted to make a new Jerusalem, a new place to worship, have their freedom of religion in the new world. But an aspect of this that is not often brought out is how do they plan to organize their society? Uh, Again, the usual story says, well, they had a hard time in the wilderness and it was difficult to get settled in. And during the first year or so, they suffered from lack of food and had almost starving and starvation wiping them out. But that finally they were able to create a harvest. And they were so thankful to God that they decided to give a celebration and they invited the Indians from the surrounding forest. And that's the beginning of Thanksgiving. The only problem is that we have to ask the interesting question, why did they have such a difficult time when they first set up the colony? And the fact that so many died from lack of ability to successfully bring about economic prosperity, just in the most fundamental sense, food for everyone. And the answer to this is told in the diary that was kept by Governor Bradford, the governor of the Plymouth colony. And he points out that among the reasons why the Puritans wanted to come to the New World is that besides the religious persecution, they wanted to escape from what they viewed as the corruption of the old world, a corruption based upon selfishness, greed, avarice, all connected with the institution of private property. And the idea that property makes you acquisitive and selfish and greedy towards others. So that they decided that they were going to not only make a new religious society in the New World, but a new economic order guided by the ideal and the principle to be found in the ancient Greek philosopher Plato's famous book, The Republic, particularly as was the case in his story of the Republic of the guardians. Now, the guardian class were to serve the community as a whole, and in this task, they were to be focused on the good of the society and not of themselves, and that therefore to prevent any temptations or perverse motives, the guardians would live in communism. There would be no private property in the normal sense. They would dress alike. They would eat in a common barracks. They would share their meals together. Uh, Obviously, there are the biological attractions of the sexes, so that would go on among the male and female members of the guardians. But if the female became pregnant from one of these liaisons, not marriages, uh, after the birth, the child would soon be taken away from the mother to be raised by the community as a whole. And that way, she would not be tempted to be so concerned with her own child or the father of that child that they would focus on their own and the child's betterment compared to the wider community. So this is what the motive that guided them, Governor Bradford says. So they laid out the property of the colony, and they were going to work the land collectively, and they would share collectively in what was produced, and they would do their home chores and their cooking and the other necessities of everyday life in various collective ways. The problem was, as Governor Bradford relates this, is that at first it seemed as if everything would be okay. There would be particularly the most conscientious and industrious members of the colony who would be up early in the morning with their sons, going off to the communal fields to begin the day's work. But it was also noticed that there were some other members of the colony, other men and their sons, who would sort of lackadaisically show up later, not be really putting their shoulder to the grindstone as diligently. In other words, goof off and loafers. And the motive of these people who were less industrious was saying, why do I need to work hard? Regardless of whether I'm very productive in our common effort or less productive, I get to get an equal share of whatever the colony as a whole produces. So there's no need for me to work harder than I want to assure that I have something for me and my family. The industrious ones became resentful, Governor Bradford tells us. Resentful that they were getting up early in the morning, working harder in the fields. Well, these other fellows show up late, do hardly any work, and the industrious ones are going to have to share the outputs of their productive labors with the less productive. This happened among the women of the colony. And obviously, at a time which far more, quote, traditional division of labor among the sexes, the women resented that they would have to be cleaning the clothes of other husbands or children who might not be as caring for how dirty they got the clothes. They didn't want to cook in common and have to do the chores of the community in common. So there arose resentment and animosities among the women of the colony. So the result was, Bradford explains, is that at the end of the first year, the crops was very small, and the upshot of it was many of the colonists died of starvation. And then this was repeated the second year, and the result was basically the same. The industrious became more lackadaisical and less hardworking themselves, and the lazy ones remained the way they were. And another year passed, and even more died because of a lack of food and other things that were necessary in the wilderness. At this point, Bradford says that the elders of the colony got together and realized that if this occurred one more time, one more winter, the result would be is that the colony would just die out. They had to figure out a way to do something different to prevent this from occurring once more. So they decided that they would try a different idea. They would take the common property of the colony and divide it up into family farms, family plots. And each family was told that they had the liberty and the latitude to produce on their land, either growing a crop or raising wildlife, animals, in any way they chose. And that anything that they produced as a result of this would be their families to do with as they wanted. Now, the result was is that suddenly, Bradford says, now that the land had been divided into family farms, basically, the husbands and the sons would be up at the crack of dawn, starting their work on their own family farms, fields. The wives and the daughters were doing far more industriously the household chores, milking the cows, churning the butter, cleaning the clothes, doing the cooking. And the upshot of it is that even the lackadaisical and more lazy ones realized that They only get to keep what they grow on their assigned family farm. So even the lazy and the less industrious ones began to be far more diligent in their work. The upshot of it was is that at the end of this next year, and the harvest came in, and rather than starvation due to a lack of food, each family had been raising huge amounts of food or raising large numbers of animals. And they had been told by the colony elders that anything that you grew or any animals you raised that you did not need for your own consumption, any surpluses could be traded freely with your neighbors for anything that your neighbor had grown or raised that you'd like to have and enter into an exchange with them. The result was is that at the end of this season, not only was there a bountifulness, but more than enough to be able to be trading with the Indians in the surrounding forests and inviting them to a celebration to God for having survived in the wilderness and not faced inevitable extinction if they had continued with their original order of things. So the result was is that if one reflects upon this, what you realize is that what we're celebrating at the time of Thanksgiving, this time of the year, is not only the founding of an early group of colonists that began what now we call the United States, but a group of people who came to the Americas with the ideal of communism and discovering through socialism in practice its failure in creating perverse incentives, low productivity, and abject poverty among all those who live in such a society. And the realization that if prosperity and opportunity were to exist, they had to redesign their institutions into a different one, which is private property, self-interest, freedom of exchange, with the resulting latitude to create great bountifulness of so much so that they could trade with each other for mutual gains and betterment. So in other words, when we're sitting around the table at this time of the year, eating the turkey and passing the yams and sharing the stuffing, what we're really celebrating is the demonstration of the failure of communism and the truth and the validity of both freedom and prosperity from the beginning in America of free enterprise in the capitalist system.
Yeah, that's a great summary of what went on there. You know, what I find fascinating about the story, Richard, is that they were motivated by pure good intentions. I mean, they were very religious and they said, we're all in this together, share and share alike. This is what God wants for us. We can't get greedy because God's opposed to greed and avarice and coveting and envy. So we're going to have a system where we all share and share alike. And yet, that's a system that produces death and starvation. And instead, they come up with this entirely different concept that says, no, you can keep everything you earn, and then you decide as a religious person what you're going to do with the fruits of your earnings. You're free to donate. You're free to help out others. And so it was still based in terms of religion, this new system, but it actually was better because now people are not dying. They're not dying of starvation. They're sustaining their lives, which, of course, is consistent with what God would want people. He wants them to live, survive, prosper, and then they're free to do what they want with the excess of their money. And I think there's another point here too, is that when you're barely subsisting and you're barely producing enough to feed your family, you don't have the means by which to help other people. All your efforts and all the fruits of your earnings have to be devoted to your family and to yourself. It's only when you start producing a surplus that you can then start thinking, okay, that person needs a little bit of help and I'll go over there and help them, but it's all voluntary. What I gather about this society that you just described was it was mandatory that the colony said, this is the system and that's it. Now, as you know, there have been instances where there's communes, like here in the United States. I think one was called New Harmony in Indiana, I think. Uh, well, this is not socialism or communism in the sense that there's coercion here. These are people that have gotten together and said, we're going to share and share alike. We're going to have the same kind of society, but all on a voluntary basis. You're free to leave if you want to leave. But interestingly enough, those went under too, Richard. I mean, the whole concept of producing things collectively is what's the defect here. And I think another great lesson to be learned here is that the United States, the American people, our predecessors of Americans, our ancestors, they really did discover the secret to higher standards of living. You know, we hear a lot about the causes of poverty, and there's large scale poverty around the world, and what can we do with it? And the standard response is always have government wage a war on poverty, have government help the poor. When actually it's counterintuitive, but that's actually carried to its logical extreme is the cause of poverty. I mean, if you look like at Cuba and North Korea, those are people that live very desperate lives in terms of economics. And the reason is because the government has collectivized everything. The government owns everything, and everybody is forced to share and share alike. Everybody works for the government at a minimal salary. The American people, after Adam Smith produces his famous book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, come up with an entirely different concept. And of course, this is after the Constitution calls into existence the federal government. But the concept is exactly how you outlined it here. Everybody gets to keep everything he earns, with the exception of slavery. We know that was one of the bad exceptions. But other than that, everybody keeps everything he earns. There was no income tax in the United States for over 100 years. If you make it, you keep it, and you decide what to do with it. And when you combine that with things like sound money, because it was a gold coin, silver coin standard, no paper money, along with open immigration and no drug laws or welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, et cetera, no warfare state, no Pentagon, CIA, NSA. I mean, this is the real key to the huge rises in standard of living in the 1800s. I mean, as I understand it, from around 1870 to around 1915 or so, real wages, not inflationary wages, real wages doubled, and then they doubled again for workers. It was an incredible period of time. And Americans had discovered the secret. This is the secret to ending poverty. And that secret goes all the way back to the society that you were describing at Plymouth.
In addition, I think it should be pointed out is that in many ways, the Puritans had a naivete in their acceptance of Plato's ideal from their own religious perspective, because certainly the New Testament comes out of the Old Testament, and there are the Ten Commandments, right? And the Ten Commandments say, "Thou shalt not kill." Well, that means I can't kill you to get what you have. You have a right to your life, right? God gives you your life. In the Old Testament, only God can take away your life. So you have a right to your life. Thou shalt not steal. Well, that means that the presumption is there is rightful as well as lawful property. That which a man has produced or honestly acquired through trade is his to keep. It follows from one of those 10 commandments. You have a right to your property. Thou shalt not bear false witness. I would say that in modern language, that says no cheating and no fraud, no deception in your dealings or in your statements to others about arrangements you enter into. And then there's also, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. That means that it is very common for us to be envious of others and resentful that they have more than we have, that they have things better than what we have, and to feel that you want to take it from them, or you'd rather tear them down than try to improve yourself. So from the very 10 commandments, one can conclude that there's a right to life, a right to property, a right to honest voluntary dealings with others, and a prohibition that each of us should attempt as best as we can, given the nature of ourselves, to curb and resist the motive of envy. Well, if you look at those things, then there's only one social economic system that matches those underlying principles. And what is that? A society based upon voluntary personal freedom, voluntary association, and respect of private property under an impartial rule of law.
I am really glad that you mentioned those particular commandments, specifically, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods, and thou shalt not steal, because we see so much talk in American society about inequalities of wealth. Oh, it's just terrible. There's billionaires in society. Oh, look at all the poor people and so forth. And the idea is that they want government to take money from the rich and give it to the poor. It's that whole concept is just legalized stealing. It's all it is. I mean, if the poor person goes and robs the rich person, oh yeah, he's condemned as a thief, and they'll send him away to jail. But if the poor person goes to the government and says, "Hey, tax him and give the money to me," oh, this is all fine and good. But it's not fine and good. It's enshrining stealing within your political system. It's taking what doesn't belong to you and giving it to someone else. And now we know, Richard, that when we live in this kind of society, which is a welfare warfare state kind of society, that there's a lot of ill-gotten gains that people are making. I mean, the defense contractors and the people getting all those welfare contracts and so forth. People are making money illegitimately. But we condemn that just because of the process, not because somebody has more and somebody has less. We condemn it because it's the very nature of the system that is wrong. But what is driving all this sentiment about inequality of wealth? It's what you pointed out. It's envy and it's covetousness. It's saying, "Oh, I really hate that person because he has so much and I don't have as much. But I'll feel really good if they just take away his money. Even if they don't give it to me, I feel better because now he's closer to my level." And the ultimate upshot of all, I mean, this is what really drove the communist revolution in Cuba. Now, I'm not suggesting that before Castro that there was a free market private property order. On the contrary, I mean, we know that under Batista it was more in the nature of a fascist regulated system, what we call crony capitalism. Um, but Castro comes in and he says, inequality of wealth is bad. And so we're going to nationalize everything. We're going to take from the rich. We're going to give to the poor. They turned over people's mansions to the poor. There were 3 or 4 families living in one mansion. Um, but the problem with this system is it goes back to the original concept you started out with, that when you go off in this direction of legalized theft and legitimizing envy and covetousness in your economic system, everybody ends up equal, but everybody's poor. Everybody has nothing. And so I ask you, in a general free market, a real genuine free market that you and I favor, a private property order, let's say that the poorest people in society are making $50,000 a year. The richest people are making $1 billion a year. Uh, Compare that to a society where everybody is equal and everybody's making $100 a year. Which is better? Which one would you prefer? Well, I think the answer is, for you and me at least, is that you prefer the free system, the free market system, because everybody's better off, even if some are better off than others. That on par, that's a much better system where everybody has nothing and everybody's struggling to survive. So I think that the big lesson here is we need to question the whole premises of this whole welfare state and warfare state way of life, because it's really a throwback, it seems to me, Richard, to going back to this original Plymouth society.
Yeah, your point about the effect of the attempt to equalize. Well, I recently was watching on YouTube the last question time that Margaret Thatcher did in the British House of Commons before she stepped down as Prime Minister. And she was being harangued by obviously the more socialist members of the Labour Party opposition. Don't you realize that your policies have intensified and exacerbated the problems of inequality in British society? And she calmly, no, she is not letting them set the terms of the debate. She says, "Oh, so rather than a society like this, you'd rather have a society like that." In other words, rather than inequality with everyone having rising standards of living, you'd rather a society of increasing poverty with equality of poverty. And of course, the Labor Party people all went crazy, but she said it with such calm, confident certitude that that's it. It's either freedom or poverty. Which do you choose? And that was her last question time in the House of Commons before she stepped down. But obviously, having been forced out by her own party did not in any way change her confidence that freedom was a lot better than the alternative.
Well, yeah, but Richard, what's pathetic is that there's a lot of people that would say, yes, I prefer the second choice. I prefer this because what matters to them is equality, even if everybody has nothing, as compared to this, where a lot of people have high standards of living, but some have more rather than less.
But the crucial thing here, which you also mentioned, is that how do you assure that equality of income, which inevitably involves inequality of relative poverty for everyone? There's no way to guarantee such a society than through the coercive power of the state. If you leave people alone to peacefully and honestly deal with each other in the marketplace, inevitably there's going to be the professional sportsman, the basketball player, the football player, the baseball player, who fans love to watch play the sport, and they're going to make multi-millions of dollars. Or the Steve Jobs, who invents something as creative and innovative as the iPhone, for instance. And the result is they're going to have multiples of income above what many other people in the society earn. But that type of inequality has been honestly earned. No one's arm was twisted to buy an iPhone. My wife and I recently purchased the new iPhone 14. We were in the Apple store a few days ago. Okay, no one forced us in. No one held us down while our credit card was taken out of our wallet to compel a purchase. We were interested in new phones because of the qualities, the features, the advantages, the usefulness of the product, and that we were willing to pay the price that the seller was saying is the one at which he would part with one copy, one unit of his product for sale, the phone. That happens all the time. The same way the people who either go to the sports arena or pay a fee to watch live sports streaming on television are paying the sums to the teams that they use to get the best players who they have to bid against each other to get their contracts, which means you have these inequalities of wealth, but there's no force, no fraud, and no violence. The difference is that people will rise to their own levels. Inevitably, some will be more prosperous given their innovative capacities in pleasing others in the division of labor of the marketplace. But for those other people who you were talking about, to assure an equalization of income and wealth and the resulting poverty that comes with it, they must inevitably use the power of force to violently take what belongs to some people and to transfer it first to themselves as the determiners of who gets what, and then their decisions as to how much will be redistributed by them to those who they think are more deserving. And the need to constantly be doing that, because once that stopped, the natural inequalities of ability, skill, expertise, productive capacity among us would rise to the surface. I'm a professor who teaches economics. Uh, I'm not Steve Jobs. I'm not Bill Gates. I'm not Musk. My salary is much more modest than that, and my salary is better than others in the society. But the fact is, I don't envy, I don't resent the Steve Jobs or the Bill Gateses or the Musks of the society to the extent that they've earned their wealth in a relatively free market and honest way that still persists to one degree or another. I don't resent that at all because their wealth has only come from satisfying me and others who are interested in their products. What I do resent are those in the society who want to take their wealth, let alone mine, and redistribute it according to their ideal of what they think a good and fair and just society is, even if it means using the power of violence and ultimately the authority of death to make it happen.
Yeah, well, that's what the income tax was all about. I mean, keep in mind, Americans lived without income taxation for more than 100 years and an IRS. And when they enacted that income tax, they said, and they got the 16th Amendment in, the promise was, we'll only tax the rich. This is just so we can get the rich's money. In other words, envy and covetousness. Well, we all know how that worked out. But the point you're making, Richard, is that in a genuine libertarian society, a free market society, the consumer is sovereign. The consumer decides who's making the money. I mean, I know that as a college professor, you think you sit there and say, I'm much more brilliant than these baseball players and these soccer players. And so and I know you sit there in anguish over the fact that you're not making the same amount of money as they do. But it's the consumers that have decided you're just not too valuable, Richard, relatively speaking. They've decided that the soccer players are more valuable than you. That's who they want to spend their money on. And that's why any distribution of wealth is a fair system in a free market system, because it's based on free exchange. Somebody may not like some actor, but if the consumers like that actor and they want to go patronize his movie, those are where the salaries are going to go, into that field. And what's unjust about that? To me, that's a perfectly just system where the consumers are deciding on free voluntary exchanges who are the ones that are going to make the big money.
Now, I want everyone who's listening or watching this to realize the abuse to which I have been forced to suffer. He has infringed upon my safe space, and without even a trigger warning, he's attacked my self-esteem, my sense of self-worth. I think that Jacob Hornberger, having done this to my emotional state and well-being, owes me reparations.
Intentional infliction of emotion.
To make sure that I get the fair share of reparations that he owes me for having abused my psyche in this manner.
They call it intentional infliction of emotional distress. All right, Richard, on that fine note, I want to wish you a happy Thanksgiving, you and Anna and all your family. And I want to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you very much for your great support of FFF. Keep in mind that this is our end of year fundraising drive. We greatly appreciate your support. But you guys just have a nice celebration. Well, no, I guess we're filming this before Thanksgiving, Richard. I forgot. This is going to show after Thanksgiving. So I'll say I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving. Richard, I look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.